The manor stood on the precipice of oblivion, a crumbling edifice of stone and shadow. It loomed against the bruised twilight sky, a monolith of forgotten terrors. The wind howled through the eaves, a mournful dirge that echoed within its hollow heart. An unseen presence, cold and watchful, permeated the grounds. The scent of damp earth and decay clung to the manor, a testament to its long and sinister history. Each stone, every splintered window pane, bore silent witness to the unspeakable horrors that unfolded within. This was no ordinary dwelling, no mere pile of crumbling stone and timber. The manor had stood for centuries, a silent sentinel to the changing seasons. Generations had come and gone, their lives and deaths intertwined with its sinister legacy. Tales were whispered in hushed tones, passed down from one generation to the next. Stories of sudden disappearances, unexplained accidents and chilling apparitions. Locals spoke of the manor with a mixture of fear and morbid fascination. They knew its dark secrets, the whispers that clung to its walls like cobwebs. They told of a malevolent entity trapped within its depths, its rage and sorrow echoing through the ages. Now, as twilight deepened and shadows stretched long and hungry, a lone figure approached the manor. A lone figure emerged from the swirling mist. Silhouetted against the dying light, he seemed an apparition himself. Tall and gaunt, with a shock of unruly silver hair, he moved with a strange, unsettling grace. His piercing blue eyes, like chips of ice, scanned the manor with an unnerving intensity. This was Edward Davenport, scholar, historian and renowned antiquarian. He had travelled from the hallowed halls of Oxford to this desolate corner of England, drawn by the manor's sinister reputation. For years he had scoured ancient texts, seeking evidence of the supernatural. Davenport's fascination with the occult had begun in childhood, sparked by his grandfather's chilling tales of haunted houses and spectral visitations. As he grew older, his interest deepened into a scholarly pursuit. He devoured every book he could find on folklore, mythology and the paranormal. He studied ancient rituals, delved into forgotten languages, and travelled to remote corners of the globe, seeking evidence of the supernatural. But it was the manor that truly captivated him. He felt an inexplicable connection to the place, a sense of dread and anticipation that quickened his pulse and sent shivers down his spine. As Davenport drew closer to the manor, a palpable chill settled over him. The air grew heavy, laden with the weight of unseen eyes. The wind seemed to whisper warnings, its mournful howl echoing his own growing unease. He paused at the edge of the overgrown drive, his gaze drawn to the imposing facade of the manor. The once grand estate now stood in a state of advanced decay. The stone walls were blackened with age and neglect, the windows boarded up like the eyes of a corpse. A shiver ran down Davenport's spine. He had anticipated this sense of unease, this palpable aura of dread. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what lay ahead. Davenport, undeterred by the oppressive atmosphere, approached the manor. He produced a weathered, leather-bound journal from his worn satchel. Its pages, brittle with age, contained a meticulously handwritten account of the manor's troubled past. The journal spoke of the Blackwood family, once masters of the estate. Their reign, it seemed, was one of cruelty and depravity. Each successive heir seemed more wicked, more consumed by a darkness the manor itself seemed to cultivate. Tales of unspeakable acts were recounted in chilling detail. Davenport read on, his blood running cold. The journal spoke of a hidden chamber, a sanctuary for the Blackwood's most perverse desires. The journal entries became more frantic, the handwriting a spidery scrawl. The writer, a young maid named Eleanor, described a growing sense of dread that permeated the manor. She wrote of shadows that moved independently in the periphery, of whispers heard through locked doors. Eleanor believed the Blackwoods were dabbling in forces beyond human comprehension, that their wickedness had awakened something ancient and malevolent within the manor's very foundations. She described a change in the family, a descent into madness. Their eyes, once filled with life, became vacant and cold, reflecting a terror that chilled her to the bone. Then the entries ceased abruptly. Driven by a morbid curiosity, Davenport continued his exploration. He navigated the decaying corridors, each step echoing ominously in the oppressive silence. The air hung heavy with the stench of decay and the faint, cloying scent of decay. He came to a room at the end of a hallway, its door slightly ajar. A chill emanated from the darkness within, sending a shiver down his spine. He pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in protest, and stepped inside. The room was a library, its shelves lined with leather-bound volumes. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows that danced across the walls. Seated in an armchair by the fire, his back to Davenport, was a figure shrouded in shadow. Davenport cleared his throat, his voice echoing strangely in the silent room. "You seek answers," the figure rasped, his voice a dry, rustling whisper that seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves. Answers that should remain buried. Davenport, though his mind screamed at him to flee, found himself rooted to the spot. The figure's eyes held him captive, their unnatural glow seeming to pierce through to his very soul. "You delve into matters not meant for mortal minds," the apparition continued, each word a nail hammered into the coffin of Davenport's sanity. "This place, this manor, it feeds on curiosity, on the insatiable thirst for knowledge. But beware, for some truths are best left undisturbed." Davenport's voice, when he finally found it, was a dry croak. Who are you?" he managed to stammer. The figure let out a low chuckle that echoed through the library, sending chills racing down Davenport's spine. Panic seized Davenport. His breath caught in his throat, a strangled gasp lost in the suffocating silence of the library. The spectre, a swirling vortex of shadows and malevolence, advanced with an unnerving grace. Its touch, Davenport knew, would be his undoing. He stumbled back, his foot catching on the edge of a rug. He fell, his hand instinctively reaching out to break his fall. He landed heavily on the cold stone floor, the impact driving the air from his lungs. Davenport scrambled back, his eyes never leaving the approaching spectre. The spectre, its form momentarily wavering, seemed to shrink back from the crucifix. Davenport, his heart pounding against his ribs, held his ground. The silver felt warm in his hand, as if infused with a power beyond his understanding. But even as he clung to this sliver of hope, doubt gnawed at the edges of his mind. Was this real? Was he truly facing a being from beyond the veil? Or was his mind strained by years of obsession and fueled by the manor's sinister atmosphere playing tricks on him? He had always prided himself on his rationality, his ability to separate fact from fiction. When Davenport opened his eyes, the library seemed to have shifted around him. Bookshelves loomed like menacing giants, their shadows stretching across the floor like grasping claws. The fire in the hearth had dwindled to glowing embers, casting dancing shadows that played tricks on his eyes. The spectral figure was gone, vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Davenport, still clutching the crucifix, slowly rose to his feet. His body ached, his mind throbbed with a dull ache. He was alone. "You are not alone, Edward Davenport." The voice did not come from behind the bookshelf, as Davenport had expected. It seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves, a disembodied whisper that sent chills racing down his spine. Davenport spun around, his eyes scanning the library, searching for the source of the voice, but there was nothing. The library was empty, save for himself and the oppressive weight of unseen eyes. "Who's there?" Davenport demanded, his voice trembling despite his best efforts to control it. "Show yourself! You are in grave danger," the voice continued, ignoring Davenport's pleas. "The manor, it hungers." The scream seemed to go on forever, echoing through the library, reverberating through Davenport's very being. His blood ran cold, his breath catching in his throat, a strangled gasp lost in the suffocating air. The temperature plummeted, the air growing thick and heavy with the stench of decay, the cloying scent of death. The library floor began to crack and split, revealing a gaping chasm beneath from which tendrils of mist rose, swirling around Davenport's feet like spectral serpents. The library itself seemed to contort around him, the bookshelves swaying and groaning like living things, their shadows twisting into grotesque shapes that danced along the walls. The fire in the hearth sputtered and hissed, the flames turning a sickly green before dying completely, plunging the room into an almost tangible darkness. Davenport stumbled back his hand instinctively, reaching out to brace himself against a bookshelf. But instead of solid wood, his fingers met only cold, damp stone. The bookshelf had vanished, replaced by a wall of rough-hewn stone, slick with moisture and cobwebs. Panic welled up inside him, threatening to consume him. He was trapped, snared in a web of terror, not of his making, but of his own seeking. The manor, he realized with a growing sense of dread, was no longer content to merely whisper its secrets. It was about to unleash its full fury upon him. The floor beneath Davenport's feet began to tremble, a low rumble that quickly escalated into a violent shaking. Books tumbled from the shelves, their pages flapping like the wings of trapped birds. Dust rained down from the ceiling, choking the air and obscuring his vision in a swirling haze of grey. He cried out, his voice lost in the cacophony of sound, a desperate plea for mercy that went unanswered. The room twisted around him, the walls seeming to close in, pressing down on him with the weight of centuries of darkness and despair. The scratching sound returned, louder now, more insistent, but it was no longer confined to a single bookshelf. It seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, a chorus of unseen claws scraping against the very fabric of the manor. Davenport sank to his knees, his body trembling uncontrollably. The silver crucifix slipped from his grasp, clattering to the floor and rolling away into the shadows. He reached out for it, his fingers scrabbling against the cold stone, but it was just out of reach. He was alone, utterly and completely alone, at the mercy of forces he could not comprehend, let alone control. The manor, he realized with a chilling certainty, was alive, and it was hungry. The shaking subsided as abruptly as it had begun, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. The air hung heavy, charged with a palpable sense of anticipation, as if the manor itself were holding its breath, waiting for the opportune moment to strike. Davenport, his senses overloaded, his mind teetering on the brink of madness, slowly raised his head. His eyes, wide with terror, darted around the transformed library, searching for any sign of the spectral figure, for any indication of what awaited him. The library, once a haven of knowledge and quiet contemplation, was now a grotesque mockery of its former self. The walls pulsed with an eerie green light, casting grotesque shadows that danced and writhed like tormented souls. The air crackled with an unseen energy, making the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. And then he saw it. In the center of the room, where the floor had cracked and split, a gaping chasm had opened up, revealing a swirling vortex of darkness below. From its depths emanated a cold, ethereal light, casting long, distorted shadows that stretched towards him like grasping claws. He was trapped, caught in the heart of a nightmare from which there was no escape. A figure began to rise from the chasm. Slowly, deliberately, it ascended from the depths, each movement filled with an unnerving grace that belied its grotesque form. It was a swirling vortex of shadows and light, its edges constantly shifting and reforming, as if it was struggling to maintain a cohesive shape in the material world. Davenport, his mind reeling, his body frozen in place by a primal fear that transcended rational thought, could only watch in horrified fascination as the figure drew closer. It was neither man nor beast, but something altogether alien, something ancient and powerful, something that filled him with an instinctive terror that chilled him to his very core. As the figure drew closer, the air grew colder, the stench of decay almost unbearable. The walls of the library seemed to pulse in time with the beating of Davenport's heart, a symphony of dread that echoed through his very being. He knew, with a certainty that transcended reason, that this was it, the moment he had been both dreading and anticipating since his arrival at Blackwood Manor. The moment he would come face to face with the true horror that lay at its heart. The figure stopped a few feet away from Davenport, its form solidifying, the details of its grotesque visage slowly resolving in the eerie green light. Davenport squeezed his eyes shut, bracing himself for the inevitable. But instead of the icy touch of death he was expecting, he heard a voice deep and resonant, echoing through the library, a voice that seemed to speak directly into his soul. Edward Davenport, the voice boomed, each word vibrating through the air with an almost physical force. "We have been expecting you." Davenport, his eyes still clenched shut against the horrifying visage he knew awaited, dared to take a shuddering breath. The stench of decay, the cloying sweet scent of death filled his nostrils, sending a wave of nausea through him. He felt a cold dread grip his heart, a premonition of some terrible fate about to befall him. "Open your eyes, Edward Davenport," the voice commanded, its tone brooking no refusal. "Look upon the face of your destiny." Slowly, reluctantly, Davenport opened his eyes. The library, bathed in the eerie green light emanating from the chasm, swam before him, the grotesque shadows twisting and writhing like tormented souls in the throes of eternal damnation. His gaze, drawn inexorably upwards, met that of the figure standing before him. And then a gasp escaped his lips, a sound of utter and complete disbelief. For the face that stared back at him, the face of the creature that had risen from the depths of the manor's darkness, was his own. Not an exact replica, not a mere mirror image, but something more. It was as if his features had been twisted and warped, his humanity stretched to the very breaking point, his soul laid bare for all to see. The eyes, however, those remained his own. But they were no longer the eyes of Edward Davenport, scholar and antiquarian. They were the eyes of a madman, filled with a cold, calculating malice that chilled him to his very core. "Behold," the figure rasped, its voice a grotesque echo of his own, "what you have always been, what you were always destined to become." Davenport stumbled back, his mind rebelling against this horrifying truth. But deep down, in the darkest recesses of his being, he knew it was true. The manor, the creature, they had merely shown him the darkness that had always lurked within his own heart. His insatiable curiosity, his relentless pursuit of knowledge, had led him down a path to his own destruction. The figure, his doppelganger, his doom, smiled, a chilling, knowing smile that spoke of secrets best left buried, of truths too terrible to bear. "Welcome," it whispered, its voice a seductive caress that sent shivers down Davenport's spine, to Blackwood Manor. Welcome home. And as the chasm beneath them yawned wider, swallowing the library, the manor, and Edward Davenport's very soul into its abyss, he realized, with a final horrifying clarity, that he was not the first to tread this path, nor would he be the last. For the manor and the darkness within it would endure, waiting patiently for its next victim, its next willing participant in an eternal dance of terror.